Good morning. Hi, I'm John, one of the pastors for our Tri-Campus.
Good morning. My name is Yumiko, one of the pastors at High Rock Brookline. 日本語でお聞きの皆さん、おはようございます。
We are so glad that we could all gather together this morning. You know, I keep hearing this word unprecedented. And if I didn't know better, I would think that unprecedented means really, really bad. I mean, we had unprecedented fires in Australia and now in Brazil. We had unprecedented migrant crisis at our southern border. We have an unprecedented rise and fall of the stock market. And now an unprecedented pandemic in our response to flatten the curve. But nothing seems as unprecedented as the recent run on toilet paper.
Yeah, so you know, when I read those stories about people hoarding toilet paper, I thought it was ridiculous. I personally pride myself in having trust in Jesus, not in the pile of groceries. So the other day, when I had to go to Market Basket to grab a tub of oatmeal, I was determined to get just one tub of oatmeal and nothing more. But you know, when I walk into the store, I saw empty shelves, which never happens at a Market Basket. So that was really unsettling to me. And when I grabbed the oatmeal, instead of one, I thought, well, maybe I should grab one more. And then I thought, instead of heading to checkout straight as I had planned, I thought, oh, I should grab a bag of cashew just in case, maybe 3 more. And then at that point, I'm thinking, I think I need ramen. So I went to grab a bag of ramen, 5 bags actually. And I can't haul all of that. So at that point, I'm going to go get cart. And once I get the cart, it's over. I'm throwing in 3 boxes of pasta, frozen fish, kale, tomato sauce. And next thing I know, I walked into the store just thinking to get 1 tub of oatmeal, but I was walking away with a pile of groceries. And I didn't need all the food. The reason why I got them is because I was afraid if I don't get them now, they won't be available later. And I was thinking about it, and I don't know why we do things like that.
You know, when I was in college, I had to read the French existentialist philosophers, a miserable group of people, really. But then again, they were living through they were living in a Europe that had been destroyed by a world war, so I can understand. Well, the leader of this pack had to be Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote a book called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is a real page-turner. Sartre observed that scarcity is the overwhelming human condition, the overwhelming rule of life. There's just not enough to go around. You know, the pie is only so big, and if you get a bigger piece of pie, that means I get a smaller piece. While closer to home, there's no toilet paper.
Well, that makes sense. Well, let's take a pause here, and I wanted to kind of invite you guys also to interact with each other via our live chat stream. John and I have been talking about how in the ways that our fear and kind of anxiety and scarcity thinking has shown up in our lives. So we know that you all have some more stories and examples to share. So why don't you guys do that, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. And meanwhile, we're going to put up some questions on the slide.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great discussion. You know, one of the problems with the scarcity mindset is that we start to get competitive, maybe even a little bit mean. And all of those pictures of toilet paper shelves that are empty are kind of funny, but it's less funny when we start to see videos of people actually fighting over those rolls of toilet paper. Like Sartre said, we are all afraid that there just isn't enough to go around. We all start from this mindset of scarcity.
And that's what we're talking about today, and we want to hear what God has to say about that. Several High Rock churches are in a sermon series called Unlearn during the season of Lent to learn the habits that are harming us so that we can learn the godly habits that will heal. And today, we are talking about unlearning the habit of scarcity so that we can learn the habit of generosity. Our passage today starts off with Jesus looking for a place of solitude. Jesus had just learned his close friend John the Baptist had been killed, so he was in need of alone time. But the crowds couldn't let Jesus go because they were only focused on what their needs are.
Well, they must have been pretty desperate because they actually beat Jesus' boat to the other side of the lake. But Jesus saw their need and he responded generously, and he healed all of the sick people in that crowd. But there was still a problem. You see, with so many people, literally thousands, there was still a lot of unmet needs. And so the disciples came to Jesus and they presented this problem to him, saying, you know, these people need to eat, Jesus. You know, there's nothing here for them. They need to head into town and, you know, go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or something. But Jesus said, they don't need to go away. You need to give them something to eat. Now, the punchline at the end is that there were 5,000 men plus women and children. Even if they had had a convoy of chicken and rice trucks, feeding all of them would not have been easy. But even so, Jesus asked them to give what they had, but all they could see is what they lacked. Jesus asked them to act with generosity, but all they could see was their own scarcity. They responded to Jesus, you know, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. We have so little, Jesus. We can't possibly do what you're asking of us.
You know, we often think that disciples are so silly to have such a little faith. I mean, they had just watched Jesus heal the sick people in the crowd. They had seen example of Jesus, what it looks like to act out of generosity. But when Jesus asked to follow the example, the disciples, their response was with their own fear and scarcity, and their response was, "That there's not enough, Jesus." Have you experienced something like that? In your own life, has God ever asked you to do something that seemed too difficult? Or maybe has God asked you to be generous when all you can see is scarcity? Now, again, let's take a moment to talk about that with one another in a chat, and we'll have some questions on the screen. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion. I was thinking about this, and my response would be, people often ask me whether I think about going back to Japan, where harvest is full, plenty, but workers are few. And my response always is, I don't know if I can find a job. I don't feel like I have enough training or money to go back as a missionary, which I think, come to think of it, I am responding out of scarcity mindset more than anything. So that's something to think about.
Well, as we just saw, Jesus looks out at the crowd and says, "You give them something to eat." But the disciples just look down and all they can see is 5 loaves and 2 fish. So how does Jesus respond to scarcity, the scarcity that's paralyzing the disciples? Well, first, Jesus takes what little they have and he gives thanks. The disciples look down and they say, "We only have this." Jesus looks up and says, "Thank you, God, that we have this." And he offers it up to God. I think that our first lesson in unlearning scarcity is to change our focus. Instead of looking at what we don't have and reacting with fear, let's look at what we do have and respond with gratitude. Are we looking down at what we lack, or are we looking up and giving thanks for what we already have?
And in our current circumstance, yes, there is a worldwide pandemic. And yes, we have to self-isolate ourselves out of abundance of love for the most vulnerable. And yes, things actually might get worse before it gets better. But if we look actually at what we have all this wonderful technology to gather together even when we can't physically be together. We have wonderful community that cares for one another. We also happen to be in a city which has multiple hospitals, world-class hospitals, staffed with dedicated, hardworking, also exhausted medical professionals. We also have basic water, power, trash taken out, because there are so many people working so hard to make that happen. How different might our response be if we first started with being grateful for what we do have, rather than fearful about what we don't have?
And notice what Jesus does next. After turning to God in gratitude, he sends his disciples out with only what they have. I mean, think about that. Jesus didn't just go bam and suddenly there was enough food for 5,000 people. No, Jesus sent the people out only with what they already had. And in the process of them obeying Jesus, God multiplied their efforts. And that brings us to step 2 in Jesus' invitation. After changing our focus, we need to step out in faith. Yes, what you have is not enough. No matter what you have, it will never be enough to do all that God has for you. But it's not about what you have. It's about what God will give you along the way. It's like the Apostle Paul later learned. My God will meet all your needs. God is rich and will take care of you.
And let's be clear, God did not bless them simply because they changed their focus to one of gratitude. It was only after they stepped out in faith that God blessed them. Because by doing so, they were choosing faith rather than fear. And their generosity is based on trusting God, supplying everything they needed, not based on having more than enough. When the Israelites was crossing the Jordan River to enter into the Promised Land, God told them to step forward in faith. The Jordan River is a big river, but God didn't part the water before they had to cross the river. It was only after that they stepped into the raging water that God made it possible for them to keep walking forward. You see, we often want God to supply our need before we start doing anything. Meet our need first, then we'll step forward, is what we think. But that's not faith. That's fear.
I immediately think of another example. When 10 lepers came to Jesus to be healed, Jesus told them to go to the priests and show themselves. But Jesus didn't actually heal them right then. Instead, it was only as they were on their way that they were cleansed. They had to step out in faith in order to experience God's generous provision. We all want God to do something up front. God, turn our scarcity into abundance and then we will be generous. But God says, no, put your focus on me, step out in faith, and then you will have what you need.
And it's just as it was for the disciples. They started with only 5 loaves of bread and only 2 fish. That wasn't even enough for them to feed themselves. But in the end, each 12 disciples, ended up with a basket full of leftover with them. We want our basket full of food before we start feeding hungry people. But God flips the script. God delivers the abundance only after we step in the faith. Ask any high rockers who are part of the church plants, and they will testify God's work as such. Ask about the time that they were leaving their established church, feeling like they're walking away from abundance and walking into scarcity. And they will tell you about the moments when they changed their focus from fear to gratitude. Ask them how they gave thanks to God for what they had and step out in faith. And they will tell you how God delivered abundance. We're here today as the network of churches because of God's abundance. And it all started with when a small group of people gathered on High Rock Street in Needham to step out in a faith to share what they had, a community.
Well, we are here today to unlearn the habit of scarcity and to learn the habit of generosity. And I wonder if Jesus asked the disciples to do something impossible precisely because they needed to learn this lesson. I mean, how might we begin to learn this lesson? I often like to think of change in terms of stop, start, and continue. What do I need to stop? What do I need to start? And what do I need to continue? And the first suggestion we have is to stop hoarding. When we are locked into scarcity, we tend to comfort ourselves by gathering as much as we can. When I was in high school, my grandmother developed early signs of dementia, and so she came to live with us. My grandma grew up during the Depression, a time of fantastic or great scarcity. And in her dementia, she really started to hoard things again. And I was constantly finding stashes all over the place, stashes of Twinkies or stashes just of paper or mail. Now, we don't live during a depression, but many of us are still hoarding. I mean, personal confession time, my wife tells me that I have too many shoes, and I didn't think so I went to count them, and I looked in my closet, and I counted over 24 pairs of footwear.
So what if it's a 24 of footwear or Twinkies or toilet paper or maybe for some of us the approval of others or personal worth? Many of us respond to fear of scarcity by accumulating far more than we need. But here's the thing, right? Our fear of scarcity will not be overcome by accumulating more. We beat the feeling of scarcity not by getting more, but by giving more. We move from fear of scarcity to freedom of generosity by giving. Remember, the disciples had only 5 loaves and 2 fish, not even enough for themselves, but Jesus asked them to give anyway. And that leads directly into the second application. Once we stop hoarding, we can start giving.
Now, for some of us who normally function out of scarcity, it's not easy to start giving. It's hard to believe that we have enough, and so it's even harder to give that little away, which is probably why God established the tithe as a regular habit of giving to break us out of our captivity to scarcity and fear. God asks us to step out in faith as we give so that we can also experience God's abundant provision. Additionally, the world around us is also suffering from a scarcity mindset. But what if we saw this dark moment as an opportunity to shine the light of God's generosity? The Bible tells us to make the most of every opportunity because these are dark days. The disciples saw only what they lacked, but Jesus saw an opportunity for godly generosity, and he made the most of it. How is your spiritual vision? Are you able to see the opportunities for generosity? Maybe you could ask God to give you better spiritual vision. Now, I don't know what opportunities God has placed in your life, but let me share some examples that I've seen and heard about in my world. I know people who have gone to elderly folks in their neighborhood to check in and see if they can do anything for them, maybe do some shopping to protect them from potential exposure. A lot of small local businesses are really being hard hit during this time, even being shut down. And so I know folks who've decided to buy gift certificates from them in order to help tie them over. I also have been part of a discussion in which several people committed to paying their housekeepers for the next 2 months while they're out of work. That's a generous vision. What are the opportunities that God might open up in your world?
And you don't have to do this on your own, right? You can join with others together, learning the habit of generosity together, just like the disciples did. For example, during this pandemic, High Rock Southwest Boston, just like many other churches, can no longer meet in a regular Sunday worship site. They meet at this assisted living house called Rosendale House. But instead of seeing only what they lack, what Southwest Boston did was able to see God-given opportunity. So High Rock Southwest Boston is going to be the hands and the feet of the residents who live in the house. I think many of them are low-income seniors. And so the volunteers of High Rock Southwest Boston is actually going to go, like Pastor John just mentioned, they're going to go out and get groceries so that the residents themselves don't have to expose themselves to the risk of COVID-19. And as we speak, Pastor Andy from High Rock Southwest Boston, I can't say their church name, and Pastor Megan from High Rock Metro West are actually working together to figure out what are the more ways that we as a community can serve better to the more people in the greater Boston area. So please stay tuned for more opportunities to serve together.
And finally, in addition to things that we might stop and things we might start, it's also important to remember to continue in the ways that God is already leading us. Many of you are already doing many of the things that we've suggested, and that's fantastic. Keep up the good work. And let's continue to gather and find ways to connect during these difficult times.
So let's encourage one another to step out in faith, trusting God will provide what we need as we serve and give generously. We're gonna give you a few minutes to kind of discuss with each other and to share what is it that God is inviting you to do at this season time, and what are your ideas and what are your examples. We will put up more questions on the slide, and before we can join back together later.
Wait, there's one more thing. Here you go. It's industrial size, so it should last you.
Toilet paper for me.